As a federal ruling puts pressure on the administration officials to testify, House Democrats are not willing to take the next big step to impeach President Donald Trump. Chairman Adam Schiff says soon after Thanksgiving, the Intelligence Committee will deliver a report with all of the impeachment evidence to the Judiciary Committee, which will then draft and vote on articles of impeachment. Chairman Schiff writes to his congressional colleagues, quote, "We will catalog the instances of noncompliance with lawful subpoenas as part of our report to the Judiciary Committee, which will allow that committee to consider whether an article of impeachment based on obstruction of Congress is warranted, along with an article or articles based on this underlying conduct or other presidential misconduct." Well, one of the Democrats who will decide on articles of impeachment is Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren of California. She was involved in the last two presidential impeachments. In 1974, there she is on the right. She was a congressional staffer when the House Judiciary Committee prepared articles of impeachment against President Richard Nixon. And then in 1998, she was a member of Congress on the Judiciary Committee and voted against impeaching President Bill Clinton. Now, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren is the second highest ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee. She joins me now for our second conversation today. Congresswoman, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us. I want to get your comment on what Adam Schiff said, that they on the Intelligence Committee are looking at these refusals to be present for congressional subpoenas and provide testimony as possible evidence of obstruction of justice, but that is for you on the Judiciary Committee to determine whether that makes its way into articles of impeachment. Give me your thoughts on that.
I think Adam has it exactly right. The Intelligence Committee has done the fact-finding. We can't be held up for months at a time through frivolous appeals of very well-reasoned decisions. We've got to move forward. But the fact that the president has instructed people not to comply with lawful subpoenas, and he's done other things, not a single document has been released, is evidence not only that he's hiding something, but that he is refusing to comply with the lawful requests of Congress, and that's an obstruction matter. That was the third article in the Richard Nixon impeachment.
There are lessons from the Richard Nixon impeachment that there are a few people like you who were there then. You were there for the impeachment proceedings against Bill Clinton. What do you see here that you've drawn experience from in the past?
Well, it's certainly a picture of misconduct on the part of the president has emerged over these hearings, and it has everything to do with subverting the constitutional system for his own personal interests. That certainly was not present with Bill Clinton. He was charged with lying about sex, not an admirable thing, but really not much to do with the Constitution. We're not talking about President Trump lying about sex and lying about paying off these women that he was caught with. That has nothing to do with the constitutional order. What we're talking about is activities that really threatened the national security and the will of Congress, the appropriations that were enacted duly to keep Russia from trampling all over Ukraine.
Congresswoman Lofgren, one of the new lines of attack, and there have been several from Republicans since this news about the quid pro quo and Ukraine military aid for an investigation into Joe Biden came out. One of the latest ones is that you all are so occupied with this that no legislation is being undertaken and nothing is being passed. You took issue with that.
I certainly do. We've passed over 300 bills out of the House of Representatives that are just sitting over in the Senate. I don't know what Mitch McConnell is doing, but he's not doing any legislating. Everything from closing the loopholes on background checks for guns to the Violence Against Women Act. We did a huge ethics reform, the biggest ethics election reform in many decades. We've done measures to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. Just this last week in the Judiciary Committee, we marked up a bill to deal with the farm labor in the United States, as well as decriminalizing marijuana, because half the states have legalized it, and the federal government has not followed along. We're very busy, but we can walk and chew gum. I wish we could say the same for Mr. McConnell over there in the Senate.
You said just this last week that belies what some of your colleagues from across the aisle are saying. You're actually getting legislation done in the midst of all this. For those Americans, and there were many millions of them watching the impeachment proceedings, they got to see Devin Nunes there, the ranking member on the Republican side. Something very interesting has emerged about Devin Nunes. There are allegations that he sought info about Joe Biden from Ukraine. And I want to play one of the interactions he had with a Fox Business News host about this.
Bottom line, were you in Vienna with Shokin?
Yeah, so look, Maria, I really want to answer all of these questions. And I promise you I absolutely will come back on the show and answer these questions. But because there is criminal activity here, we're working with the appropriate law enforcement agencies.
That's a weird statement. Were you in Vienna? Well, because there's criminal activity, I can't tell you about this. This is the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee.
Well, I have no idea what he's talking about, but I don't really want to comment on Mr. Nunes. I'm sure that whatever occurred will ultimately be revealed. What we're focusing in on is President Trump and whether his actions threatened our democracy, whether they threaten our national security, and if so, what should we do about it?
But it'd be strange to have a congressman who oversees some of these hearings being involved in the actual thing that's being investigated.
Well, yes, it would, but I don't want to jump to a conclusion based on snippets of news reports. We'll wait happily for the full piece of information to come out. Meanwhile, we have our job to do coming up in the House Judiciary Committee, which is first to receive the information from the House Intel Committee, to evaluate it against the standard in the Constitution, which is misconduct on the part of the president that constitutes treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, what does that mean? There is a meaning in it. And back in the 70s, when I worked on the Nixon impeachment, the staff, I didn't write it, other staffers did a document explaining what is impeachment. What do those words mean? I've got that report on my website, so if people want an early entree into the history and the legal meaning, what did the founders think? Go ahead and read that little report. It's very revealing.
Those kind of things used to be dry reading for nerdy folks, and now it is it's the hot ticket. Congressman, great to talk to you twice today. Thank you for joining us, Congressman Zoe Lofgren of California.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.